I'm being hopeful and optimistic that we can sort of go back towards that a little bit to soften it a little bit for the central business district.
Anyone else? Comments or questions? Hearing none, I'll ask for a motion to approve this major site plan application and its associated traffic impact study. No motion? More discussion? Do we have an alternate motion?
There is no other option, correct?
That is true, as our Development Services Director has indicated, and it shows in our UDO. If they meet the criteria, we have no choice but to approve it.
This is what's considered a by right application. So if what's proposed is found to meet all applicable standards and the use is allowed in the zoning district, then yes, by right, whether it's the planning board as the approval authority, whether it's staff as the approval authority, or whether it's the alderman as the approval authority, those standards within North Carolina general statute are clear, and they apply uniformly to every local government.
Okay. Well, having said that, and all options apparently being exhausted, then I'll make a motion then if there's no other way to do it. So I'll move to accept.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Thank you, Jack. Motion is on the floor. Any final discussion?
I'd like to hear from the architect.
Well, is your architect here tonight? Would anyone, would by applicant or either of the owners wish to speak to or have any comments? Yes, ma'am, please.
Sure. Amy Schaefer, I'm here on behalf of the applicant, and again, we would just reiterate that if Mr. Henley or the planning department would like to put forward some names for individuals who would be willing to meet and talk with the applicants and the property owners about design features, they would be willing to look at those names and consider an open dialogue, but nothing further at this time on the design.
Thank you, Ms. Shaver, for reiterating that. I think I can probably speak for the planning board at this point to say we accept that offer, and we'll have staff look into that for us. Thank you for making that comment. So we have a motion. All in favor? All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Second item of our new business. Travis, if you'll go through Oakton subdivision for us, please, for the staff's report.
I am actually going to turn this one over to Mo Meehan, city planner.
Go ahead, Ms. Meehan.
I figured the community was tired of hearing my voice at some point. So.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the board. As you know, we presented this Oakton Major Subdivision Preliminary Plat at your November 17th Planning Board, and it went to a committee. So this is the preliminary plat itself. It's an approximately 20-acre site, and they're proposing 42 single-family home lots in this subdivision. And to kind of give you an idea of the process for this major subdivision review, we're at the planning board recommendation, and the planning board is to approve, deny, or conditionally approve and send a recommendation to the Board of Aldermen. The Board of Aldermen will then approve, deny, or conditionally approve the subdivision, and then that would authorize the subdivision to start doing the infrastructure installations. They have 24 months to get their infrastructure installed, and then they would submit a final plat that would then be again approved by the Board of Aldermen. And then at that point is when you would start being able to pull individual building permits for the project. Just some information, some background on zoning. This is like I said, an R10. That's the residential 10,000 square lot is your minimum square footage, with a minimum lot width of 75 feet. There's interconnectivity with the Hammocks subdivision, and it is around some other, it's all residential within that area. The review committee that was with Vice Chair Will Hewitt, Chris Jones, and Dick Sloan met on January 11th, and at that committee meeting there were 3 main topics that were brought up after the review of the subdivision as a whole. The main one was the one-way entrance detail, or the Stewart Avenue entrance, I apologize. When they were speaking with the applicant, the committee requested 3 options for them to consider: no entrance at all, a trail or a multimodal type of entrance, so it would just be maybe golf carts and bikes, something very low intense, and then the other one was a one-way option. The applicant agreed that they would go back with the one-way option. They kept the 60-foot right-of-way that is found throughout the subdivision and narrowed the street itself, so there's still a nice open space there with the landscaping. They also said they would be providing one-way street signs and a do not enter sign when you are on the Oakton Boulevard, so you won't be able to turn right onto there. The second topic that was brought up was buffering around adjacent properties. There are, like we said, there are some established communities around Fodell and Stewart Avenue, so the review committee asked if there was some way they could do that. And if you'll see, they have retained vegetation as much as possible around the perimeters, so they're not going to be removing these trees. They're going to stay. They're going to retain those. And so that's how they have tried to accomplish that, and the committee accepted that as well. And then the third one was the drainage and stormwater retention. There were main concerns of the stormwater runoff causing flooding on Stewart and Fodell, because this is such a, there are issues currently on Stewart and Fodell after large events. So they wanted to make sure that the design is going to keep it from flooding. So they asked the engineers for the applicant to run 100-year at a 24-hour event calculations for the pond itself, and the calculations showed that it will not tip. It will be able to hold that amount of water. And our city engineer also reviewed their calculations and came to the determination that yes, it would not fail. So it would be able to hold the water and not flood the streets. And also they noted that as they have designed the stormwater system, post-construction runoff rates will be less than the pre-development rates that are existing now. So we had our last committee meeting on March 7th when they provided us with the new entranceway and talked to us about the stormwater and drainage retention and flooding. After consideration of those, the review committee agreed to send this back to the full planning board with a recommendation of approval to the Board of Aldermen.
Are there questions for Mo from board members?
I got one.
No.
The guarantee from the calculations, I know engineering calculations can be pretty precise, but this is Southport, and with the flooding around here that's happened over the past years, especially with a serious hurricane, are they guaranteeing that? And if by chance the flood comes and the calculations are off, who's going to be responsible?
I appreciate that question. I know that there are no guarantees of anything. Mother Nature has a way of finding us down here, I agree. One thing I would say is that all we can do is go by the known calculations and how these work, how the systems are designed, and they do work for the communities that they are. That said, Greg, do you have, or no, I'm sorry, Greg, Adam, did you have anything you would like to add to that possibly? I apologize. This is Adam. He's one of the applicants' representatives.
No, that's basically.
Can you come up to the mic? I'm sorry.
While he's coming up, just using the NOAA storm duration calculator, a 100-year, 24-hour event in that location is 13.3 inches of rain in 24 hours.
Yeah, and that's correct. And anything more, we can only design something for so much. It'd be nice to design something for a 500-year storm, but if you start doing that, then it's almost impossible to build anything. But it'll be more than adequate than everything else that was designed a long time ago, for sure.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know, because I know what happened when I was here when Hazel hit, and I left town when Florence hit. And when she said, you know, it's sort of like I heard the word guarantee, or maybe I didn't hear that word. There's no such thing in Southport on this water, because when it comes, it comes. Oh, yeah. And you can tell, because when it rains real hard, if you want to know what neighborhood not to build a house in, drive around and you can tell. All right. Absolutely. Thank you. That's all I had.
Right. Thank you.
I have questions.
Okay.
I wasn't on this committee, so my questions are about that. Can you back that up, please, Mo, to get to the, I get that map right there.
Okay.
Let's go with, there you go,
Sure thing.
landscape plan and tree mitigation.
Yes, ma'am.
Bullseye, right there. About the clear cutting of these lots, and I guess it can go to speak to flood waters and rain, that kind of thing too, but I go back to when this planning board approved the Haven, we were able to secure that developer's agreement to keep more trees than they'd originally planned, plus they agreed to install even more than they originally submitted to us. We have a tree protection ordinance, it's 3.18, in our UDO, in place to preserve what we have, not just see to mitigation. This clear cut is inconsistent with the spirit of that ordinance. It appears from the information that's been provided in the tree survey here, there are sizable trees in the lot setbacks that could be left. So I wasn't at the committee meetings. Is there a reason that was given why these can't be left, rather than clear cutting and creating this very homogeneous design just along the streets? The survey submitted shows several large live oaks, one being about 25 inches. The survey doesn't distinguish between the types of oaks and pines that are in there, and there are non-native species on the survey, a lacy elm, for instance, is included here. So can somebody help me with why these trees aren't the ones that, so many of them, that everything is just being taken out? That was on, anybody on the committee or Mo?
There was not a discussion with it. Well, we did bring up that they were taking out a lot, and we asked them to leave as many as possible within the setbacks. That was at one of our review committees in the January meeting. They came back. They did not make any revisions to that. I believe that the live oaks were specifically called out in the traffic study, I'm sorry, in the tree survey. The other ones are just, they said they were going to be mostly laurel oaks that would be probably there, which that's what they have, the answer I got from that. And the non-native tree that you were speaking of, they said that was more of an and or, so they will stick with the Nuttall oak for those trees, not a problem. If anyone for the review committee has anything, please.
So also, to my understanding, this was submitted prior to us making the ordinance, and so our hands felt tied, unfortunately. And I think one big learning that we had from this, which I feel like a lot of these committee meetings are learnings, to say the least, as developers poke holes in the UDO, that the trees, the way that they're laid out on nothing but sidewalks and on top of easements, is something that I think we should address in the ordinance. And we had talked about putting trees directly on top of utilities, because I think we looked at the water and maybe the power. We're directly under, I think, one side of all of those trees. And so then you start to question whether or not those are going to live. So unfortunately, I think the developer did what they wanted to do rather, and didn't seem terribly interested, and maybe I'm misspeaking, but didn't seem terribly interested in mitigation was their solution, not preservation, is my take on it. But again, a learning from it is I think we do need to look at and address just the standard. I'm an engineer, and I hate to sort of blanket all this, but I'm an engineer, so I need to mitigate, so I'm just going to put trees along the sidewalks, and they're going to be every 1.3 inches on my paper, is what it looks like. And I think there just needs to be some more thought there. And I'm not sure if we can have a staff recommendation, come up with something to figure out how to address that, because it doesn't seem like a very thoughtful solution.
I should point out, to Mr. Jones' point, he is correct that this was submitted prior to the most recent tree ordinance revisions, which with them came a number of standards that are specifically addressed clear cutting and quite frankly prohibiting it through the course of new subdivisions. I do want to let the applicant speak, though, with regard to the native species question as well. So.
I think she answered it, but the tall oaks, there was an option there to use either or, and I talked to the landscape designer, and we'll just use the Natal oaks instead of the elm that was shown on there. And a lot of the reasons I'll speak real quick on, we would like to save as many trees, but as far, our first goal too is for stormwater, for the safety of everything. And so when we have to do grading to get stormwater to a certain point, a lot of times some of those trees are going to die if we leave them where they're at. But we try to save as many as possible, and it has to work with the grading plan as well to keep everything from flooding. So, thank you.
Travis,
Yes.
if the applicant wanted to go under the new guidelines, would there not be credits for any trees saved towards this mitigation cost?
Yes, there are.
So I would think that would be worthy of at least considering. Otherwise, you'll look just like the hammocks.
I agree 100%. I double-checked where the live oaks were, where they were removing them, and one of their all within the right-of-way. Because I did double-check that for some retention credits to see if they could keep them, but they're all within that, the grading zone.
In the right-of-way, meaning in the streets? Not in,
Yes.
not in the setbacks?
Not in the setbacks. I was really hoping, because I wanted to see if we could get those. And also, the retention credits are only for specifically live oak retentions, not any other species at a certain size.
Well, for me, I go back to the conversation that was held when we went through the Haven submission and the very positive outcome that we got out of that. For me, I'd like to see this tabled and sent back to the committee to have some more review of this and maybe discussion with the applicant. It's just me, but is there anyone else that would want to comment on that?
If that's the pleasure of the board, then, yeah, we could review it an additional time. If that's the pleasure of the board, so.
To my understanding, they're meeting the requirements of the previous ordinance, correct? So I guess not to put the applicant on the spot, but how willing would you be to have these conversations about trying to save trees?
I think in the, I hate to speak for the developer because but I think they try to be as accommodating as they can. And they've also worked with the one-way access too, which has kind of hurt them as well. So I don't know if, I think they would like to do it now, sorry. But yeah. And they've tried to meet, and they've met all guidelines that were required, so.
Let me ask you this.
Yes, sir.
If they do want to push this through, possibly one option would be as well that we could look at it, tree mitigation possibly on a lot by lot. Could we do a lot by lot basis as well, helping them to save as much as possible?
As long as the ordinance allowed it, then sure. This being another by right project, our ability to, we certainly want to make sure that all the goals and objectives of the city are met, but at the same time, we can't be granting variances or anything like that. That's the role of the Board of Adjustment. So we've got to be careful with, really, the ordinance is the ordinance in this particular case.
Thank you.
Any other comments or discussion? Okay, there being none, do I hear a motion to approve the application as submitted for forwarding to the Board of Aldermen for its deliberations and a vote on it?
I'll make a motion to approve the site plan and make the recommendation to the Board of Aldermen.
Thank you. Motion's been made. Do I hear, motion on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Next, alley abandonment. Who gets this honor? Travis, you're rising. Travis, can I back up for just a second and ask you another question? Go ahead and step on up there. I meant to ask this question for 115, okay? If in the final deliberation or the determination of the restaurant occupancy, if it's anything above 200, is there a possibility, what do we do about that traffic impact analysis at that point?
It's a very interesting question.
Thank you.
By my reading of the ordinance, and I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but there's a section of the ordinance that talks about what is considered a major and minor revision. And so if those changes to occupancy resulted in it being determined to be a major revision, then the approval authority of the major revision is the same entity that approved it the first time. So such a revision, if it were deemed to be major, would come back to this board for their approval. And I will tell you that in reading the ordinance, what the line between what is a minor revision and what is a major revision, there's a lot more things that would be considered a major revision than are a minor revision.
And one other question about that, I noticed looking through our packets, I believe this had been discussed before, but on their actual application, and I apologize that they left before we had this conversation, I just wanted to ask about this. The fee is not shown on this application. It was dated 11/30/21. Do you have that information on how much that fee was and when it was paid?
I'd have to go back and look at how much it was, because unfortunately I wasn't here for any of that.
Right.
It certainly was paid. I don't have the exact date for you. But
I don't know the exact date either. I believe this was submitted in October of 21, but I don't think that fee was paid until like August of 22.
And given that I was not here and employed by the city until Halloween of 2022, I can't speak to why that's the case.
Okay.
But it's as likely that the fee wasn't submitted as it was that staff didn't. Ultimately, when staff accepts the application as complete, then it's deemed complete, which is...
I understand. Like I say, I forgot to ask those questions
Sure.
earlier. I apologize. Okay, take us on into the alley abandonment, please.
All right. As we mentioned earlier, the alderman received a request for a partial alleyway abandonment. This is at the northern end of a dead-end alley, meaning it only connects on one end. It connects to West 9th Street, but it does not connect to West 10th Street. It is west of North Caswell and north of West 9th Street, and the request, as it is before you, is only for the northernmost portion of the alleyway, essentially the dead-end piece of the alleyway. This is the overall area that we're talking about. Again, you'll see West 9th Street running along the bottom of the screen, and then North Caswell running along the right side. The alleyway runs right through the center between 306 and 310 West 9th Street. Specifically, it is for... Sorry, I had to make sure that color showed up. It is for the portion of the alleyway that is shown in color on this map. It is not for any other portion of the alleyway. I do want to point out that there is a proposed subdivision map as part of your packet. It is a proposed recombination for these properties. The future approval of the alleyway abandonment has no bearing on any sort of recombination, and vice versa. The recombination is a separate process, and whether the alley is abandoned or not, that still would potentially be possible to do some form of recombination. I should tell you that as proposed on this map, this recombination is not possible. So, but that's a separate matter. Just wanted that to be clear. The review committee met 3 times about this proposal. Various different discussions were had. There was also a site visit that occurred as well. Some of the things that were discussed included potential abandonment of the full alleyway, everything from West 9th Street all the way up to the end. Abandoned city infrastructure within the alleyway. We don't know the extent yet of how much abandoned water line is in the alleyway, but we know that it at least starts to run into the alleyway. Future needs for the alley. just in general, what it has been used for in the past, what could it be used for in the future. Currently, it is wooded. There is no organized improvement to this alleyway at this point. And then, of course, precedent, previous discussions regarding the abandonment of alleys and if this alleyway would set a precedent. Ultimately, the review committee did not reach consensus on a recommendation. We had one yes, one no, and one undecided. So at that point, the vote was to send the request back to the planning board without a recommendation attached to it. I said this earlier, but I want to reiterate that at this point, all the planning board is tasked with doing is providing a recommendation as to whether or not to sign the resolution of intent to abandon the alleyway. If the aldermen ultimately vote for that, in favor of that resolution of intent to abandon it, that triggers a whole separate process that requires a public hearing in front of the aldermen. So, and that process is laid out by statute, and there's that excerpt from statute is located in your packet. At this point, that concludes staff's presentation. As you heard during public comment, the applicant is here and can answer any questions, and certainly the review committee can provide their feedback as well.
Is there any committee that would want to make comments for the board?
Well, I'll fess up, I'm the undecided. And the reason I was, and the reason I am is because, first of all, I believe we should have canvassed everyone who was attached to that alley. But not only that alley, I asked that there were additional alleys that are under the same circumstance, and that we should give those residents all at one time an opportunity to decide how they want to, what they want to do with it. Now, we had something similar to this one time before, where we had residential property or commercial property on the west side of town that people wanted to turn into residential property. Because years ago, as most people may or may not know, there was commercial property over there because that was a segregated section of town. They had their own businesses, and they could not attend our businesses, so they had commercial entities over there to service that community. And there's also many other reasons that those alleyways were put in, as far as being able to transport things back and forth from the waterfront district, where we used to have a very large shrimping and fishing industry, and that's how that traveled. The other factor was I was at the meeting of the Board of Aldermen when the future land use was discussed, as far as Parks and Rec, where we were looking at land, how to acquire land for pedestrian walkways, trails, things that could be used by everyone. And that was another idea of thinking that these alleyways are really not large enough for vehicles, but after a canvassing of the area, maybe there could be some throughways that would be allowed to allow people to travel alternate means, such as on foot or bicycle. It's not, and just designate those alleys as non-vehicular traffic. But first of all, in fairness, because growing up here and knowing what that community had gone through over, the last 150 years, I thought it would be the fair thing to do to canvass every one of those residents who are still left in those original homesteads, that they should be allowed to have their voices heard on this if they wanted to. So that's why I was undecided on that, and I still believe that they should.
Madam Chair, I was on that committee also. I won't have to tell you my vote. You'll probably guess what it was. One of the things is on alleyways, and I did a little research on that. In some of your cities and things like that, they have adopt a alleyway program where people go in and clean up the alleyways. Now, that's nothing new. You can check it out. About, I think it was I want to say about 1880, the city of Southport gave a commendation to a gentleman named Gib Davis because he cleaned up the alleyways. It was actually right down here on Davis Street. Now, he didn't live there, but he went in and cleaned up the alleyways. So my deal is, what I was under the impression is because the alleyways was grown up and all, that by abandoning them, they could go in and clean them up. Well, if you do what is called adopt an alleyway, you could do the same thing because Southport had alleyways, if you check the old maps, throughout the whole city. And some people, I won't call any names or anything like that, they put up fences, and those fences went across those alleyways. That's why you see some of them are no longer going all the way through. It's because people put up fences and other things, and part of the blame we have to lay it with the city. I mean, that's the problem we have with the alleyways, and it's one that, as Will said, unless you give everybody a shot at these, you're going to have a problem, and that's me.
So I guess as the third member of that committee, I was the one that voted for intending to get rid of them because I thought it might set a precedence as far as getting rid of all of them and getting the steps in motion there. And I think to Travis's point earlier is that there is a public comment section where I think it would be really beneficial to hear from people who are affected by all of that and who have been. And so, again, my recommendation would be to, I forget how Travis worded it, but to recommend that the intention, I forget Travis, maybe I'm losing words here.
A resolution of intent to abandon.
The resolution of intent to abandon, so then it can start that process of a public hearing, a public meeting, so then the alderman can hear from the public specifically around that. And again, to start setting some precedents of how we can make this right. I think doing nothing right now would stall this out, personally. And I don't know how, if we recommend not to, what Travis said, insert quote, then I don't know how you move forward.
Anyone else?
Just keep in mind that isn't very wide for an alleyway.
As I looked at all this, a couple things stuck out to me. We don't have any clear precedent for this from the past, and there's a very real perception in the town, probably rightfully so, that Southport's kind of been used for property before. We've been taken advantage of for property in the past, and I don't see any real advantage to the city for this abandonment. From what's been presented to us, the only advantage seems to go towards these property owners that's asking for this. I don't see any real rush to do this myself. We don't have a submission for the subdivision other than it's what's on this map that's been shown us, that nothing has come forward to us about that. So we don't know exactly what's going to be done with that property.
Madam Chair, to that point, regarding the subdivision, a recombination of parcels, because, let me go back to the GIS snippet. Well, actually, you can see it there. So if you'll notice, there's a bunch of dashed lines. So this subdivision is a recombination, is considered an exempt subdivision under North Carolina general statutes. So it's not that they can do whatever they want. There's still rules in place in terms of what the lots can look like, and that's why I made the comment that that division as proposed is not in compliance with what can be a recombination. But if a valid recombination plat was proposed, the planning board would not see it.
Okay, thank you, Travis. So what's the board's pleasure? Sounds to me, from what we're hearing, Travis, is it appropriate that our best option at this point, without a consensus from the committee to move forward, send it back to the alderman? Would that be taking this intent forward to them, for them to pick it up from that point and move through the rest of the process where they would have a public hearing on this then, and it would ultimately be their decision, correct?
Ultimately, regardless of if the planning board votes to recommend approval, denial, recommend nothing, just send it back to them, the Board of Aldermen would still have to vote affirmatively on a resolution of intent in order to start the rest of the statutory process. And I'm more than happy to read that process into the record if that's the pleasure of the board.
Is it the general statute here that we've all been presented in our packets? I don't, unless someone wants it read into the record, I don't see any reason to read this statute in. You have it in your packets. I guess for me, just give you my opinion, I think we should send the matter back to the Board of Aldermen with no recommendation from us, asking instead that they discuss it and direct the city's path in this matter. Anyone else?
If we are going to do that, I would suggest very strongly that we canvass that area and get a consensus from the public prior to any public hearing, so they will know exactly the feelings of that community. As it stands right now, without that canvassing and without knowing that, I can't recommend it.
You can't recommend abandonment of it, right? Okay.
So Travis, if we make no recommendation, say that phrase one more time. Sorry.
A resolution of intent to abandon?
The resolution of intent to abandon. If we make no recommendation on it, the aldermen will still go through the process of having public comment, right?
The same way they do at every public, every regularly scheduled meeting, they would have public comment there. And then if they vote yes on a resolution of intent to abandon, then there is a whole separate statutory process that to set up the public hearing, and there's specific notice requirements that must be met in order for any decision afterwards to be valid, which includes publishing of the notice of the public hearing for 4 consecutive weeks in the paper of record for the community, certified mailers to every adjacent property owner, and posting in 2 locations the notice of the hearing, which for this would be kind of difficult, but we'll figure out a way to do that if that's where we end up. But all of that only happens if the aldermen vote yes on a resolution of intent to abandon. There we go.
Madam Chairman, I like your idea. We just send it back to the aldermen and let them make that decision.
I kind of don't know anything else to do, frankly. I mean, they punted it to us. You know, we're going to send it right back because we don't have a clear recommendation to give them.
I think is the only person who had recommended moving it, the recommended for the resolution of intent to abandon, wrote it down. I think, I just want to make sure there's public comment, because I've always enjoyed sitting in committee meetings with Donnie because I get educated, I mean, at the end of the day. So I think, I just would love to hear about all the past sort of things that happen with these abandoned alleyways in the city, and I would love for those folks to come up so then the city can kind of get a sense of what to do with them. Because I think to Sue's point, it's that this one abandonment benefits one property owner, doesn't benefit the city. I don't know, I want to hear from the rest of the community, and I think if we don't have to make a recommendation in order to do that, then I'd like to make a motion to make no recommendation on the resolution of intent to abandon this alley.
We do have to have a motion. Is there a second? Motion has been made. It's on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. It's great discussion for that. I appreciate that. And Travis, just for the public's benefit now, doing this will put in motion the alderman making that decision to move forward with that, and a public hearing will be held or public comment will be received where these owners, for those interested, can come and submit their comments to the Board of Aldermen.
If the aldermen vote yes on the resolution.
To move ahead.
If they vote no on the resolution, then it stops. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we will, at this point, move into public hearing on the proposed conditional zoning amendment. We do need, and Travis, if you will, just take a minute before we move into that to bring us up to speed on how we're sitting at this point where we are.
Sure. Conveniently enough, that's my first slide. So at least one great mind thinks like a not great mind, but okay, cool. So as a reminder of where we are from a process standpoint, in January, this was presented as an idea to the planning board. That was the meeting where we were at Indian Trail. Essentially went through conditional zoning the way it currently is written in the Unified Development Ordinance, because it is currently in the Unified Development Ordinance already, and then some potential opportunities for changes to that process. In February, there was a presentation of the first round of draft language and solicitation of feedback from the planning board and the public. This was the presentation in which I spoke for 3.5 hours about various discussion points and examples of cases from my past, and got a lot of really great feedback from the planning board. In March, well, actually, let me back up. At the February meeting, it was a decision of the planning board to call this public hearing that's happening tonight. In the intervening time, it was also decided to hold a second meeting, that was just an open, sort of presentation update as to where we were following the meeting on February 16th, and then to take questions from members of the public, which is what we did on the 8th. Now, we're here on the 16th. It is a public hearing. It is on your agenda as a voting item, and your options are to approve it, deny it, or recommend approval, recommend denial, or table it with additional direction to staff for further changes. Once the planning board votes on that recommendation, then the case is presented to the alderman, again in a public hearing, which is always, no matter what is proposed to change about the Unified Development Ordinance, the aldermen always hold a public hearing. And then the aldermen, their options are to vote to approve it, to vote to deny it, to vote to table their request with either direction for staff or just time to consider the request further, or to remand it back to the planning board with direction. I've seen it happen. So I believe, Madam Chair, that was what you were looking for, but if there's anything else you'd like me to touch on.
Nope, that's exactly what I wanted. Thank you, Travis.
Absolutely.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to ask for a motion that we go into public hearing.
So moved.
Thank you. Motion is on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. We are considered in public hearing. I'll ask our Deputy City Clerk to call the names of those who signed up to speak.
Gaines Brown. Did you want to speak about the alleyway?
Well,
Wait, I'm sorry.
Can't do that? He can't do that?
yeah, the matter's closed at this point.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We've determined the closure to that point. Thank you, sir.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
And Madam Chair, I do, not that if the board doesn't want me to do it, I won't, but I did have a presentation as well. But I can wait to get there.
Let's go ahead and have
That's fine.
the comments. And then we want to hear your presentation, Travis.
I didn't want to assume, so.
No. All the information that everybody can get on this, we want that to happen. Tanya, I'm sorry.
Genti Pronti.
Madam Chair and members of the Planning Board, thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to comment and give some of our concerns about this proposed amendment change. I live in Indigo Plantation, and I have some concerns and questions about the changes in addition for the conditional zoning to the proposed zoning text amendment application. And some of my concerns include, quote, flexibility for developers, that's listed as a benefit, and quote, smart growth principles for Southport. According to the 2020 updated Southport CAMA land use plan, most of the large residential areas, the land areas in Southport are built out already. So I asked the planning board, is that a fair assessment? That's, when I read the CAMA land use plan, and they had the numbers and the charts there, it was pretty obvious that most of the large residential land areas were already built out. Do you even know how many pieces of land aren't built out? Do you even have any of that updated data? I'm just curious. Also, do you or the city even know how many pieces of undeveloped land in Southport would be impacted or cobbled together enough to result in smart growth with this amendment change? Without specific updated information about the current buildable parcels in Southport, I'd only have to assume that with all the building that has occurred since 2020, there are most likely even less undeveloped parcels now than indicated on the land use plan, with the exception of the R20 ETJ area owned by Bald Head Limited. Even for this large parcel, the quote, smart growth benefits of conditional zoning would not be as applicable here as it would for other areas of the country, where there are no geographical limitations, no transportation issues, and no widespread attraction to a beautiful one-of-a-kind waterfront. The smart growth, which is listed as one of the benefits, is typically used in relation to infill development in urbanized areas, not as brand new development on undeveloped land external to a central location and or impacted by environmental constraints. I think that touting smart growth as a benefit for Southport is totally not applicable here. Some of the many negative impacts of conditional zoning I want to comment are related to indigo plantation. First of all, the proposed changes under 2.11B7 states that conditional rezoning requests originating from a residential zoning district and from the PUD zoning district shall not be considered unless containing at least 5 acres. Such minimum acreage must be contiguous, and I put a parenthesis "and" in that paragraph, and may be contained within one or more multiple parcels. Other non-contiguous parcels may be added to a conditional rezoning application so long as the minimum contiguous acreage requirements is otherwise met. So is it just a coincidence, or is one of the reasons for this change being proposed to override the current conflict that Bald Head Island East-West Partners has with the city over vested rights, the conflict over vested rights for the old Bald Head Ferry parking lots in the marina area? From my understanding, the city maintains that under the current PUD zoning in the marina area, Bald Head Limited only has rights to repave the parking lots. My understanding with the proposed amendment changes is that this issue for Bald Head Limited would be eliminated with the allowance of combining non-contiguous acres over 5 acres for a conditional zoning application. This would also allow the addition of a road connecting Robert Rourke Drive to Indigo Plantation Drive across from the existing Indigo Village townhouses, thus creating a major thoroughfare for residents living in the proposed Project Indigo to easily access the marina area for any amenities included with the new combined Project Indigo development. This cut-through would also be heavily used as an alternative for those coming from 211 North or Highway 87 to drop off children at the elementary school, causing even more traffic issues at the school. As it is now, NCDOT is compiling the stats from a requested traffic study to find solutions for chronic traffic issues during drop-off and pickup at Southport Elementary School, which is right outside the entrance of Indigo Plantation. With possible clustered development in the Indigo Marina area, it would even be more challenging to come up with traffic mitigation solutions. Our quiet, safe neighborhood would no longer exist, and Indigo Plantation Drive would no longer be a safe, quiet residential road used for daily walking or biking. And finally, another concern for adding conditional zoning changes is related to the possible elimination of height restrictions for multi-level condos, restaurants, and other buildings that could be planned for Indigo Marina area. This area has amazing views of the surrounding marshes and ICW. So under the guise of, quote, smart growth, cluster development in the marina area would also result in environmental and traffic impact issues. So my last sentence here is the first rule of any new development should be do no harm. So we don't have buyer's remorse like the town did back when the shoebox houses were built down in the Yacht Basin. Thank you for this opportunity.
I would add, thank you, Ms. Prunty, we appreciate that. I would like to add that, as we've said many times now, there is no application before the city for Indigo Phase 2. There's nothing sitting in City Hall about this for this application. I guess I'd ask Ms. Prunty, in response, can I just ask you this question? Are you saying that this text amendment, I just want to be clear about it, are you saying this text amendment is being proposed to help out Bald Head and in their application? Is that what you're saying, that we're doing something that's going to help one developer? Yes, ma'am, please.
Well, in light of the fact that looking at the land use plan, this large piece of land is basically very applicable to to this new amendment. So one of the benefits that was listed in Travis's presentation was, its benefits for smart development for the town, and there's a lot of benefits for the town. So it's not just for this particular developer, but because there's, for Bald Head, but because there's no other large land masses, unless you cobble a lot of them together, that the provisions, as I read it, and I would love to be, I would love to be wrong on this, my interpretation, and that's why we're here tonight, is that these, some of the changes would allow a developer such as Bald Head Limited to do some of these things, combining parcels, non-contiguous parcels together, maybe change the height requirements to have what we call smart development, so you go up instead of out. And so this is the only example that I have right now that I see could affect Southport majorly. There may be other developers that this amendment could benefit as well, but I'm just saying some of the provisions that we see in here, the flexibility, the height requirements, the cobbling together non-contiguous areas could affect us in Indigo, and this is one of the major examples that I have. There may be others, if there's other areas in Southport that are larger, that would be applicable to this. It's my example.
Thank you, ma'am. I just wanted to be clear that we're not here to debate Indigo tonight, because there is no application for Indigo Phase 2. before the city right now. Thank you, Ms. Prunty. Tanya?
Rich Bandera.
My name's Rich Bandera, and I live at 409 North Burrington Ave in Southport here. I've been here about 21 years. I've come to all of the meetings, and I've spoke at all of the meetings regarding conditional zoning. And I brought up different topics about density, and we've talked, the staff has brought up their interpretation on how it ties into the land use map. I have different opinions on some of that, but I have a different topic on that as you come to these meetings, you learn more as you go along, and you hear different things about what's being said and how this draft text amendment is being proposed. So the previous speaker kind of hit a lot of it right on the head, and I wish I was that eloquent in summarizing it. But what I heard from the last meeting was that in the language, there's things that just don't go away with conditional zoning, and they have to meet these standards. Some of them are traffic, water and sewer have to still comply. And what I really kind of hit after the meeting, I really kind of, it drawed my interest was that HOA regulations don't go away. So if you live in an HOA, you're basically exempt or protected from conditional zoning. And so what that means is everybody else is kind of chopped liver. And so saying that, I did my own diagram of the residential areas, and I kind of highlighted the different HOAs in town and the remaining residential areas, and I'll get to the smart growth topic. But if you count, let's say our land mass is 50% residential in the entire extended area. You have River Mist, that's an HOA. You have the Bill Clark development, you have Cades Cove, you have the Indigo residential part, you have Cottage Point, Jonas Creek, the Marina Village, the Haven, Old Southport, the Hammocks, the Landing, possibly Oakton, Harbor Oaks, Prices Creek. Add that up and it's almost 50% of that area of residential land. So when you take all of that out of it, you have the remaining part of the residential district that is subject to conditional zoning would virtually, and I've said this before, I think the guardrails on dimensional requirements are just totally removed. And so what the previous speaker was getting at, when you see those areas where this could potentially be impacted, not speaking about Indigo Plantation, Indigo 2 or anything like that, probably that is one of the bigger sites where this could apply to. The other site is possibly the off of next to the Landing. There's another parcel there. The remaining parts, and this is getting back to the smart growth part of it. I'm a lead AP. I've been there in that certification for 14 years, and I understand it. But what I don't understand when you get into the ideas of smart growth, where you need the idea of, well, now you have to bring separate service to all these individual parcels, roadways to all these individual parcels, sewer, all those kind of things. They already exist. If you take outside of those two sites, those roads on city services, the demand for that is there. So why are we talking about conditional zoning and smart growth for much of the R10 districts that's not part of an HOA? I mean, the HOA, I never thought I'd ever want to be part of one, but I wish I was right now. And so I'm not getting it, and I don't think that's been clarified enough, and I don't think I'm wrong on that, because that's what was said at the last meeting, that the HOA requirements can't be reduced. And so I personally, I hope you deny this request. At minimum, table it. I think some of the speakers, obviously, the attendance here is greater, and I think it'll be greater at the Alderman meeting if this moves forward. And I would ask that you, like I said, reject this proposal. Thank you.
Tanya?
Jim Lightboard.
My name's Jim Lightbourne. We live at 316 West West Street. And I'm struggling to understand this conditional zoning. So some of my questions are getting to that. I echo the comments previously made. I'm trying to figure out where this applies in Southport. So all the examples I've seen of conventional zoning don't seem to apply to Southport. And I wondered why. And I guess there was a survey done by some agency that discovered like 78% of the jurisdictions that used conditional zoning were over 25,000 in population. And I can't find any, they're anywhere near the size of Southport. So I'm struggling. I thought my first approach would be to find some examples of this, and that way I might understand how this works on the ground. So I couldn't find any examples out there. And then I thought I would try and figure out where in Southport this applies. And I came to the same conclusion as the previous speakers. I can't find much out there. So it would be helpful for me to see where we think this might apply in Southport. So then I took the elephant in the room. I said, okay, the only example I can kind of work on a little bit is the Indigo proposal. So this isn't so much arguing against Indigo. It's trying to understand how this conditional zoning could possibly apply in Southport. So there are a lot of different ways to look at this, which was mentioned before. So I'll jump to the one about density. So I need some help here with numbers. So it's said that the city estimated that there'd be about 550 dwellings possible in Indigo with the current R20 zoning. I've heard different numbers, but that's 550, I think was in the document that the developers presented. So then with conditional zoning, we'd go to the land use plan, and it designates this as a low density area. So that's possibly 2 to 3 dwellings per acre. So assuming the max of 3 units per acre, and then doing density averaging, which is what the developer did, and which is one of the principles actually in conditional zoning, which actually sounds good. If you average that out, you come up to 1,128 dwellings, 3 times 376 acres, which is what the developer used. So this then would be in the realm of possibilities, actually within the zoning area for this development. And one of the main concerns about that area was the dwelling. So is that true? Is my calculations correct? That now this would be within the realm of possibilities with that zoning. Then I have trouble with this word consistent. Is that the same as adhere to? Does it have to adhere to the land plan, or does it have to be consistent? So I looked at the map, and so I could argue that you're kind of consistent with the map if you think of that area, since it's right next to a medium use area, that's not inconsistent for that to be a medium use. We just sort of drew a line where we said now over here it's R20. So if consistency means that, consistent with what's around, now you're at a medium use area, and so that's 4 dwellings per acre. So now I'm back up to the 1,500 dwellings that the developer proposed. So is that what consistency, I don't know what consistency means. Does it mean adhere to, or is it seems like a nebulous word. So are my numbers making any sense at all? I guess that's my question. Is this thinking about this in the right way at all, in terms of the impact this can have in Southport? I was also looking at the lot across the street from us on West West, which is owned by a church that's, I'd say their membership is diminishing. What could go over there with this zoning? So is that one of the areas that we're looking at? I don't know. That's getting a little too close to home. And so my third question is, who's generating the excitement for this? I know the staff is generating excitement for them. They've said they're excited, they want to support this. And I understand that Mr. Henley was directed by the city manager to get this moving for a recommendation vote to the board, to the alderman. Who else is excited about this? We've heard aldermen speak, I heard one alderman speak, about the willingness to trade dwelling size over for a density over for building a road. So is this ways to trade these arguments around? And then who does that trading around for this? So I wonder who's just excited about this. It didn't seem to come from the planning board. It seemed to come to staff, I guess, unless it's coming from the top down. So perhaps I should close there. Thank you.
Tanya?
Francesca Slaughter.
Good evening, Madam Chair, board members, and city staff. My name is Francesca Slaughter, and I reside at 6272 Cattail Court in Indigo Plantation. I guess I'll start with the question, please show us the real benefits we're anticipating from the implementation of conditional zoning. What problems are we solving? Are we solving a problem for the city? Or are we solving a problem for developers? Southport's beautiful, it's vibrant. We're a destination for tourists and families relocating from within and out of state. If conditional use zoning is such a valuable tool, why hasn't it come before the board in the past? Why the sudden need to start using it now? Especially when the town is nearly built out and in danger of losing the last bit of open space we have left. The conditional use zoning statute is a tool, as I understand it, meant to solve problems that our current ordinances cannot, to provide flexibility that our current ordinances cannot. Where have these problems with flexibility presented themselves in the past? What great benefit did the city lose out on because we didn't have conditional zoning? Conditional use zoning is meant to allow hospitals and schools to be built closer to neighborhoods. It's, again, as I understand it, meant to allow mom and pop small businesses on street corners and encourage a walkable community. Conditional use zoning is not meant to allow us to develop a property with increased density that otherwise wouldn't be allowed. So in conclusion, let's not make it easier for developers by implementing an ordinance change that would in fact change the course of development in our community for a lifetime or more. Thank you all for listening to me, and I'm asking that you please reject this proposal, and I have full faith that you all will make the right decision for us. Thank you.
Tanya?
Jenna Fontaine.
Yeah, and you have one written comment to read, Tanya?
Good evening, members of the Planning Board, Director of Development Services, City Planner, and citizens. I have attended most of the meetings in regard to the proposed changes, specifically conditional zoning. I do recognize that it can be an additional tool for all when reviewing a proposed development project. There are a few questions and comments I would like to share. Please explain how PUD and CZ are different and the same. Why would a developer prefer to apply for CZ? Does it favor them? Although the process is longer, the document says that conditional zoning would be applied on a project, quote, most likely to be approved. Please explain. Isn't that putting the cart before the horse? Am I correct that with conditional zoning, which seems to favor smart development, The total density is averaged over the entire acreage. The example in Hampstead given at one of the meetings showed condensed housing, more continuous open space, yet still high density on the developed acreage. In Section D, quote, agreed upon concession is mentioned. Are they binding and in writing prior to construction and during? Would it be possible to add that the developer be reasonable for all or part of the cost to upgrade utilities so that the city and the citizens would not bear the burden, as in the electrical upgrade connection for Osprey Landed is estimated at $85,000. How recent is the required land survey? Example, if a project was already proposed yet withdrawn, recent storms have changed the waterways and wetlands in Southport. Southport needs to upgrade utilities, electric, sewer, and water. The combined proposed development in the city limits and surrounding areas is going to put a tremendous strain on congestion, broken roadways. Smart development is a good tool where public transportation, strong research for grants to cover transportation. Property owners have a right to develop their land. It should not be done to line their pockets and leave small towns holding the bill. Respectfully, Karen Rife.
Thank you, ma'am. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Ms. Kelly?
Madam Chair, members of the board, thank you for your time. On the surface, conditional use zoning seems the same as other zoning devices, such as variances and special exemptions. However, conditional use permits both function and operate differently. When a conditional use statute does not provide clear standards for a zoning board to apply, the statute may constitute an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority. Who decides if the use granted mitigates the reasonably anticipated detrimental effects? Who decides the use's character? Who decides if the use mitigates any natural hazards, assure public safety? How do they decide? What mechanisms are in place to settle conflict and place reasonable standards on the use? You see how the process can snowball out of control quickly? Never mind the fact that every conditional use ever granted, you are setting a precedence for the future. North Carolina gives very specific statutory limits on conditional zoning. The main concerns are spot zoning and what conditions are considered reasonable. Once the town approves conditional zoning, it can't be for a single piece of property. All properties within the area may now take advantage of the conditional use flexibility. While there are no easy solutions to the problem, that does not give us the right to ignore the issue. If you do consider taking on conditional use zoning, you must have a very detailed and specific statutory scheme on how a conditional use permitting statute should look and function. The statutory scheme must provide clear process for the applicant to follow, and additionally, must provide clear standards for the zoning board to apply. The best time to write a conditional use zoning ordinance is while you're updating the CAMA land use plan. What uses does the town need? What uses does the town want to avoid? What benefits must a use provide? What nuances must we avoid? These decisions need to be made in a long-range mindset, not just what affects me today and what affects my children's children. Ultimately, this is why we have the planning and zoning at all. Conditional use zoning does not fall under that statute. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Madam Chair, Planning Board members, city staff, residents of Southport and the ETJ, I'm Shirley Sullivan, and I live at 5002 Seaward Court. I'm not in Indigo, I'm in River Mist. I am not in favor of this conditional zoning text amendment. Beginning at the top of in the packet for this text amendment, it said this is a discussion, but I also understand that this is also, after this discussion, the planning board will vote whether or not to approve or disapprove and send it on to the Board of Aldermen. To me, what I learned from this is that this text amendment is basically adding residential to conditional zoning. We already have conditional zoning in the business district, so how does this open up the door for large developments to come in under conditional zoning? I question the urgency to how and why this was presented and who was the original catalyst. I do believe if this is approved, this will push through large developments. Conditional rezoning or zoning is popular in cities with populations over 25,000. We're not at 5,000 yet, right? I mean, what land is left? I read that the conditional zoning allows for greater flexibility, is at the discretion of the Board of Aldermen, and has more public input. There's one more additional public hearing. It refers to the flexibility in increasing or reducing development standards. While this will be a case-by-case submission if conditional zoning for residential goes through, it says it's not as cut and dry as conventional, yet it allows for great flexibility. How can conditional rezoning be the most intensive form of development review that exists under NC statutes, providing the greatest discretion by the City of Southport, and go under the same review as conventional zoning or conventional districts? Supporting comments on the conditional rezoning include some of the principles of CAMA Core Land Use Plan and the core vision and values, but it didn't include all of them. It omitted 2 of the 6 principles, one being the traffic and another one being the human scale design. Policies under Section 2 for residential were also referenced. However, with conditional zoning or rezoning, these may not apply. I'm getting mixed messages. There's so much flexibility, we will not have standards. Just like Appendix A as a table. I like the table. The Appendix A that lists the different uses, zones, but now that's going to be eliminated, and each zoning district would have a full-page definition. Can't you still have the table? So we really know what is different and what's not. I'm thinking maybe also it is time to update or change the core values and vision, because I'm not seeing where this conditional zoning in residential applies to us. We're so small. As stated by the planning board, developers poke holes in the UDO. With conditional zoning, I don't think they'll have any holes. So we give them conditional zoning? I'm still researching and learning a lot as I go along, and I thank you for letting me speak.
Anyone else? David?
We good? David Rhodes, 404 Barrington. Just a couple of things, and I didn't plan on speaking. Let me just state that the more I read about the zoning laws in town and conditional zoning, the less I understand. Maybe I'm at that point in life where I just can't absorb things. And it seems like, and I sat through all the meetings when they were revising the UDO, and it seemed like every time I got close to understanding it, the next day I didn't. So I'm going to speak in a very layman's sense. I think, and it's just my opinion, and it's no reflection on this board, and I appreciate all the work you do. I find it kind of interesting, the timing, that all of a sudden the town, not y'all, but the town is all excited about pushing or revising the conditional zoning. Even though you say there is no present application for Indigo, we know that they withdrew their application so they could come back sooner. So we know it's coming back. So I kind of find it interesting that all of a sudden the town is pushing this or asking this gentleman to whip up excitement about it. Once again, in a very layman sense, not, getting more confused. I think it's a way around the UDO. I think the town spent 3 years, I think it was, 2-3 years, revising the UDO, having meeting after meeting and listening, and for what it looked like, what I could understand, it was a pretty solid UDO, but now this is like a backdoor. This is a backdoor that would, if applied to Indigo, make the elephant go away. And then the town could point to the fact that, well, most towns are, they have this conditional zoning, so, what could we do? But I think it's a backdoor on, a backdoor and end around, shall I say, of the UDO. And it's a shame. As far as supposed excitement, there is no, maybe there is excitement, but maybe it's in a negative sense, or whatever the negative of positive excitement would be. I've yet to speak to anyone that is for conditional zoning. So I'd love to know where the excitement's coming from. And as somebody alluded to, maybe the excitement's coming from the top down, that, they want to put Indigo to rest or any other large development, because once again, we're supposedly not speaking about Indigo, even though we are. So I hate to say it, but I think that's what this is all about. And it's a shame, because I think in a perfect world, it probably would work, and in a much larger town. I think in a town this size, I think it's going to be used way more in a detrimental way than in a positive way. And you could just look around town and see exemptions. Someone said the shoebox buildings, and there's probably God knows how many other exemptions. Maybe instead of wink, wink, the old days, now they'll just apply for a conditional zoning variance, and then they'll be allowed to do it. I think we spent all that time redoing the UDO, and I would assume it was because the town knew how much development was queuing up in Indigo. As the first speaker said, we don't even know how many other parcels are buildable parcels here. If we probably started to add them up, it probably dwarf Indigo. So what do we have? What do we have, 3,000 people here now? Is that roughly? So if you figure Indigo gets anywhere where it wants, so that'll be 2x. And then if there's more than Indigo in the wings, it will be 3 or 4x, and the roads and the infrastructure can't even handle what's here. So I would implore you to, just vote that do not recommend this, because I think we're going to be open. What's that, Pandora's box? Once it's open, it's going to be too late. And just to be clear, by show of hands, is anyone excited in the positive sense about conditional zoning here? Raise your hand. Okay, thank you. Appreciate the time.
I
think just to give a little backdrop of the planning board, so we're a bunch of volunteers that this week have a 202-page document in front of us to talk about this week's agenda items. We have a UDO that's hundreds and hundreds of pages that we digest. As someone who has sat here for 3 years, I still don't fully know the UDO, so I lean on city staff. And again, this is just me sort of riffing and speaking my experience. And I trust city staff, I really do. And one of the city staff was sitting in the seat for many years before where she's sitting now. And I don't want folks to think or maybe take away that the city staff is, because we're volunteers and because we know what we know given the UDO, we rely on them to interpret, I can't say the words tonight, to sort of take in the North Carolina General Statute 160D-102. So there's a lot going on that we really trust and rely on staff. And so I want to commend Travis for coming in, looking at what's here, and then making recommendations that he thinks will fit. Because he thinks this will fit, and there is a lot of merit to, I think, what's in front of us. I also agree with a lot of what other folks said tonight, too, but I felt the urge to say something to defend Travis in a sense where we are grateful to have him, and we are so thankful to have him. And I just don't want folks to think that he is shoving something down, because we lean on him for support, and we lean on him for recommendations and ideas and thoughts. Because again, we're just volunteers. I work at a big tech company, so I know nothing about city planning, but I try to sort of interpret the UDO, apply it to the 202-page documents that we get once a month, and move forward with it. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Travis, and I don't know, stand up for him, I guess, but.
Don't want to miss it.
This is on. I didn't mean in any way to demean this gentleman. He has a job. But I also think, and this is what worries me, is that we elect people, and I forgot who the quote was, it's probably Thomas Jefferson. You elect officials and they serve to hear, listen to the people and to hopefully carry out their requests. At times, and I've only been here 7 years, but I think it's long enough, I sat through the yacht basin debacle, but here. So I think sometimes the town doesn't hear what the people are saying. And I thought I voted for people to listen to what I'm saying and what all these other people are saying, and hopefully carry that out, possibly rethink it, refine it a bit. But I think in this whole topic, the conditional zoning, and once again, we're not talking about indigo, but we are. They're not listening. The citizens, and once again, I haven't spoken to one person in town who's for it. And I walk a dog, so you talk to people all day if you have a dog in this town, right? 'Cause we all walk dogs all day. And I kind of replaying what happened with the water treatment. The treatment plant that no one in this town wanted to sell except for the board. And it wasn't a happy outcome, but I only hope the town officials, aldermen, listen to what the town has to say. I think sometimes they think they know, but I don't think they live in the same section of town as I do, because I don't know who they're talking to. It must be a select group of their supporters, because it's not the general population in this town. So I hope people listen to the people that come to these meetings. Thanks again.
Is there anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Lois Gandy, and I live in Indigo Plantation. First of all, thank you for letting me speak. I appreciate all of your work. And I just wanted to make one comment, maybe two. We appreciate you. Please know that. I know your job is not easy, as the alderman, all of you, you're working for the city. And Travis, I think he's a very nice guy. I met you and talked to you for a while last week. So I just want to say all this is listening, is the public. We're getting a chance to voice our opinions, and that's a beautiful thing. It really is. Just don't want anyone to take this personal, but this is what back and forth, what conversation should be. And I appreciate you giving us an opportunity to voice our opinions, because we are very passionate about this town. This is our life. This is our quality of life here. We're very passionate, and we're researchers, we're hard workers. We try and learn things that we don't know about. This, for instance, the little bit I have been studying and trying to learn what this is, I think it's a shaky road. I would just be cautious, because I do think there's nothing legal about it before something happens. There's nothing written. So that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to thank everybody and thank everybody that's here tonight, because this is what we do, talk to each other. Thank you.
I would echo Chris' comments, say amen to that. And Ms. Gandy, we live here too. We're passionate about this too. You know, we don't live somewhere else and just come in and tell everybody what to do. So I want to make that clear, but I also want to say, and I've said this in meetings before, and it goes back to Chris's comment, we've never had a development services staff like we have in this town right now. We've never had the expertise, the training, the experience that we have right now. I think we're very blessed, and I would say nothing is being shoved down anyone's throats, not ours. I appreciate the comments from the citizens. We really do hear. We all have 2 ears. We do hear. And we learn every time from these meetings. We learn from these packets. It's a lot to take in. But like Chris said, Travis and Mo combined are a super team for this town, establishing some, hopefully, good future direction for us from the things in which they've been involved in their careers. I'm very appreciative of what we've already been able to accomplish under them. This is a complex matter. I think, like so many other things that happen these days in the world, social media has kind of taken over conversation some about conditional zoning, and not all for the good. I think there's some misperceptions out there about it. A lot of the information that has been presented in meetings where we didn't have near this attendance to learn about it. And that's where I think social media gets into it. I've seen comments just in the last few days about multi-story buildings. This freeze opened up the path for multi-story buildings. And so I think it behooves all of us, to try to learn about things before we automatically dig our heels in and have the opinion that this is awful, and everybody from the top, basically, it's what we've heard tonight, is trying to hoodoo all of us. Come on, y'all. I mean, let's keep our eye on it here. We're not getting into election season in this room tonight, I hope. Talking about something totally different. Is there anyone else that would want to make any comments? Go ahead.
One of the, and Travis, you can help me with this one, or Mo. One of the main things about this that has come up is about the public interest. Now, one of the things that I and other members of this board have asked for was that the public be involved. And before any permit, and correct me if I'm wrong, before any application can even be received, there has to be a public input meeting with all those affected in the neighborhood surrounding that area. So that means that if you live in Indigo, or you live on Ninth Street, or you live in Cades Cove, or you live on Robert Ruark, that means before any conditional zoning was to occur, they have to meet with you. And if you don't allow it, it does not happen. Is that correct?
Well, it's a little more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's a little bit more, but yeah.
Essentially, and based on the feedback.
Hold on.
Let him speak, please.
Based on the feedback that we heard at the meeting on the 8th, the language was modified such that the application can be received by staff without the public input meeting having occurred. However, it will not get anywhere near the planning board's agenda until that public input meeting has, 1, occurred, 2, staff got notice of it appropriately in addition to everybody else that is required to get notice of it, and 3, that we know what the results were, and that document can be included in the packet for the planning board to review, and then that's what starts the process in terms of, a planning board review of it. And the first meeting, quite frankly, probably looks something like this when it gets to the planning board. And
So basically, and we're still working on this. I mean, there's nothing that's written in stone, but basically, for the most part, is if it doesn't really pass the public criteria, I mean, if it's not a benefit to the public, then, and they don't meet all
the review criteria for a conditional rezoning, one of them is consistency, and there's that word, I know, but consistency with the adopted land use plan and all other adopted plans. 2, the impacts and benefits of the project, potentially, as you're able to tell on paper, of course.
Yeah.
And 3, the results of the public input meeting.
Yeah. So you all are really part of the first step before we ever see any, before.
Certainly, in my view, certainly the first step and part of every step.
Yeah. So, good, I'm glad we cleared that up. Because I'm still learning all of this as well. And part of that is getting the language exactly right so that we do that. That's why we ask questions, but there's no backroom deal on this. We are still going, we're still learning every bit, and we're going to take what all of you said tonight and learn from that. You need to.
So it's my understanding that you all will be voting on this, whether to approve conditional zoning or not tonight, correct? You'll be voting one way or the other to table it or whatever. You're going to take some type of voting action, correct? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. One of the things being to table it for further discussion.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So my question, if you wouldn't mind, for each one of you to just help us. Some of us have done our homework, by the way, for months, and Travis can tell you that. We keep asking him, and he's been really good about answering questions. But my question to you all before you vote is, can each one of you tell me what you think the advantage is for this conditional voting amendment? What is your understanding? Just give me one advantage that you think how it would help Southport, if you don't mind.
Well, I think that'll come out further in discussion with the board. I don't think that's our place to actually go down and try to do PR for it. Like I say, as we've discussed, we depend on staff to get the information. Is there anyone else that would want to make a comment? Travis, if you will, you said you had a brief presentation.
Well, it's me. I don't know about brief, but it's not 3.5 hours. I promise you that. I can be as brief as you want me to be. All right. I keep leaving the clicker. All right. So a few things, some of which you've seen in previous slides, some of it you haven't. Just a reminder about what we're talking about here. A conditional zoning is a rezoning, the same way that a general use rezoning is a rezoning. It's a change to the zoning map of the city. They both have the same statutory process in terms of how they are reviewed, how they are approved. A general use rezoning is just a straight up change from one zoning district to another. I have R10, I want BD. I have high industrial, I want R20. That sort of thing. I have to compare just what's allowed in the first use, or in the first zoning district, and what's allowed in the second zoning district, and how that fits into the land use plan. Conditional zoning is the same thing other than site-specific conditions can be attached to it. The site plan that is provided is a site-specific condition. From there, in terms of what the board wants to allow, that's up to the board. These are the zoning districts of Southport. I'm not going to run through all of them. I think everybody here generally understands which zoning districts we have, what we don't have. So what I have here is just a collection of the draft language, just showing you what the language looks like. This is all located in your packet. Anybody who's read the packet has seen this. I wanted to highlight, though, the changes that were made prior to or after the meeting on the 8th. There's that section at the bottom here that talks about what cannot be deviated from. The staff report and the language mentions HOA requirements, and so I want to clarify that point real quick. What that does not mean is that if you're in an HOA, you cannot ask for a conditional rezoning. The city, no local government in North Carolina has the legal authority to enforce private covenants. If you're in an HOA and your HOA wants to stop you from asking for a conditional rezoning, then it needs to be in their covenants. Otherwise, if it meets the standards of what we write here, whether it's what's in the language or something completely different, it's a valid proposal just like anyone else, whether they're in an HOA or not. What's meant by that language is requirements set forth by the state that when you're building a residential project, when you have to set up an HOA for the future residents of that neighborhood. it's pretty strict. It's when you have more than 20 homes, at least if I remember correctly, unless that's changed. If you have more than 20 homes, you as a developer are required to set up an HOA for your community. When we mention HOA requirements, it means that we cannot deviate from that standard. And if it's the board's pleasure, I can make that clearer in the language. But really, it's not the city's rule to enforce anyway. It's from statute. So that's what that means. Here, this is a lift straight from PUD. I've talked about this before, but when we're talking about open space and a residential conditional rezoning, at the bare minimum, the same 20% open space preservation requirement, including the specifics that apply to it within a PUD regarding, it can't include wetlands, it's not, all of those standards. That also applies in a conditional rezoning automatically. Here, this is really the main difference from conditional zoning to our existing PUD process. The flexibility. The, I guess now infamous 3.5-hour presentation I gave included those discussion points regarding flexibility. The feedback that staff heard was that more flexibility was good at that point. So the language was amended to reflect that feedback. If it's the board's pleasure to revisit that flexibility, staff is more than happy to do that. That's up to the board. That's where that language is, though, right there. Another PUD difference here, again, minimum 5 acres. That was also a discussion point if you're starting from a residential district. Yes, it allows for other non-contiguous parcels may be added to a conditional rezoning application so long as the minimum contiguous acreage requirements are otherwise met. So if 5 acres is a reasonable amount for the board, then one option you have available to you is that if you're going to add other non-contiguous acreage, make that other non-contiguous acreage also 5 acres. Or don't allow for non-contiguous parcels. That's really, staff can write the language however the planning board sees fit. But if you keep the minimum at 5 acres and there's an applicant who would meet the multiple non-contiguous 5-acre requests and wants to submit a conditional rezoning, all you've done there is create 4 separate or however many separate conditional rezonings as opposed to keeping it in one project. Maybe that's a good thing in some cases, maybe it's not. Ultimately, we're not going to know the answer to that until the actual project comes before us, but you have options there. Most of this is language that exists in the UDO today and is not proposed to change. Do want to point out the shall instead of may for technical review committee meeting. Also giving staff the ability to withhold a project from your agenda that would otherwise go on your agenda if there's information that staff have requested that we don't have yet. I want to ensure that projects that come before this board and open up to the public are in a position to be reasonably reviewed. Up top, gosh, I hope that's legible. Up top, that is the change that removes the discretion from the planning board as to whether or not to call a public hearing on a conditional rezoning. Now, if a conditional rezoning is requested, the planning board meeting is automatically a public hearing, in addition to the aldermen, which have always been required to hold a public hearing. Public input meeting, this is the change that I mentioned earlier following the feedback on the 8th, that we're no longer requiring it to be submitted or to happen prior to an application being made. That wouldn't stop somebody from doing that if they wanted a conditional rezoning to do it ahead of the application, but does still make it clear that they cannot even grab a whiff of a planning board agenda until that meeting has been held and all of those requirements related to it have been met. Conditions of approval, conditional rezoning, that's where the name comes from, is the ability to add conditions. Just making it clear that staff may recommend conditions as well as the planning board, but ultimately, as the case with the rezoning as a whole, the conditional rezoning, excuse me, that ultimately it's the aldermen who have the final control over what conditions are applied. A lot of this is process-related clarifications, just again, making sure that projects don't end up on the agenda that are not complete. Making it clear that I know this came up, making it clear that the modification of any condition of approval shall require the submittal of a new conditional rezoning and shall include every step conducted in the original approval of the request. So if you're going to agree to conditions as an applicant, if you're going to agree to conditions, and then when you get to the preliminary plat stage and you're back in front of the board and you realize, oh, wait a minute, that condition's not working for me anymore. Okay, you can think that, but you've got to go back through the entire conditional rezoning process again to change it. That's not something that staff is given the ability to modify on our own. It's not something that the planning board is given the authority to modify. It's the alderman. Again, the whole process has to be replicated. I should point out too, I heard it come up a couple times. I just want to make this clear. I didn't include this particular slide because there's so many slides about this at this point, but this is not a conditional use permit. A conditional use permit is an old way of reviewing projects. Southport is one of the localities that had a conditional use permit system. Statute made conditional use permits illegal. It's no longer an option for local governments to use. Every conditional use permit that the city of Southport had approved became a special use permit overnight by virtue of statutory action when Chapter 160D was adopted and went into effect July 1, 2021. So the conditional rezoning, it was very complex when you had a special use permit, a conditional use permit, and a conditional rezoning. And conditional use zoning was essentially a hybrid of both of them, which I still don't fully understand how a hybrid of them was possible, but we can't do it anymore, so it's not even relevant at this point. This is a conditional rezoning again. Do just want to point out here again, and I know I've said this a bunch of times, but a conditional rezoning is not a construction approval. It requires the completion of whatever steps are necessary down the road to actually get the site approved for construction. So if I bring forward a conditional rezoning and I'm fortunate enough to have it approved, I then have to come back with a preliminary plat or a major site plan or whatever it is that covers what I'm doing and run that through the exact same process that I would have to run it through if it was a by right project. And if that requires going in front of the planning board and the board of aldermen again to get a preliminary plat approved, that's part of the deal. So this slide is from it's from the PowerPoint from last week. The smart growth principles that are in the land use plan, that's where this smart growth thing is coming from. It's not because I'm some champion of smart growth, it's because the city's land use plan talks about it. That's, what we're talking about here. Density. So yes, the way density is looked at, it is averaged across an entire project. That's the same exact way that PUDs are looked at today. That's how any zoning district that doesn't have a minimum lot size, but instead sets other ways to limit density is looked at. It's averaged across the entire site. So these This is a snip straight out of the land use plan of Southport. These two projects have the same density. It's 13 homes on the same site, 13 lots on the same site. The difference between them is one of them has large lots, one of them doesn't. And the environmentally sensitive areas are protected in open space. That's what's called a conservation subdivision. This is essentially the same thing. It allows for that, the flexibility here allows for units to be clustered in areas where development makes sense. It's Southport, it's southeastern North Carolina. It's probably reasonable to imagine that a lot of folks in this room have areas on their own property where it made more sense to put the house there than it did to put it there because of varying conditions. A subdivision is the exact same thing. In a scenario in which you're running under straight up R20 zoning, for an example, your minimum lot size is 20,000 square feet. And it's a by right project. So if what's submitted to us meets the standards of the code as it's written the day they submit, then as you heard earlier with 115 North Howe and with Oakton, we're legally obligated to approve it. And maybe that's the right thing for all development in Southport. That's how the UDO is written today. That's how it works. It's by statute. I'm not personally, I know that that's a radical change. And of course, this says 2 1/2 acre lots, and that's never going to be a thing anywhere. I mean, I don't think that's a thing in Brunswick County, or even where I come, my previous role in Pender County. We didn't have a zoning district that was that spread out, so to speak. But the same principle applies. We could be talking about amending the UDO to make this process by right. And that's something that actually existed in Southport's zoning ordinances before, that a cluster subdivision just like this was allowable by right. It was taken out through the UDO update. That was a by right process back then. If we're allowing this through conditional rezoning, it's the opposite of a by right project. It's giving us the ability to review the proposal on its merits, making sure that it still conforms to our land use plan, while also being able to fully consider the impacts and benefits of the project that potentially may or may not exist, and the results of the public input meeting. Again, another snip from the land use plan. This is, again, factors into that smart growth. The land use plan sets the parameters of what type of growth it's looking for and what type of growth it's not looking for. And just straight up, suburban style development that you would see anywhere else driving across the state is really not what the land use plan wants to see. It wants to see innovation. It wants to see creativity. It wants to see growth types that live up to the high standards that the community, I think, wants to see, at least in my opinion. I mean, this, we have how many people in this room? I know we had more talking about a process change to our ordinance. I mean, this is why planners get out of bed every day for this. I mean, this is awesome, and this is why requiring these innovative types of projects to go through, when I say rigorous, it's because it requires going in front of the planning board and the board of aldermen. It requires the public to be directly involved in every case, and having a public hearing so that the public is given the chance to speak, just like they've been given tonight, and reserving the discretion for ultimately the alderman to say that maybe this project is a slam dunk on our land use plan, but you know what? the impacts are too great, and we're going to deny it anyway. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that the inverse of that statement isn't also true. It is. I can't fix that. No one can fix that. But it's important to remember that the same process that would allow for conditional rezoning also, through a text amendment process, can amend the Unified Development Ordinance. It's the same process. So that's an important thing to remember as we're looking at any rezoning proposals or looking at any text amendment, is that there's a defined process for these things, and just because it's not approved now doesn't mean it couldn't be approved down the road or couldn't be added to the ordinance to be by right instead of through a conditional rezoning. I want to be clear that conditional rezonings can't be forced upon anyone. You have to ask for it. As a property owner, you have to ask for it. So when we're talking about multiple, contiguous parcels that could make up a 5 acres that would come before you, every single property owner has to sign off on that before they do it. If you haven't consented to a conditional rezoning, it cannot be applied to you. And I don't necessarily agree that a conditional rezoning near you then automatically gives you the ability to take advantage of a conditional rezoning yourself. Certainly not without also asking for the conditional district, but because every site is different, the impacts and benefits of the proposal, even if the uses and the density and all that good stuff are exactly the same, might be different because it's a different property. It does provide the flexibility for those smart growth goals to be achieved that Southport's current UDO does not provide. In terms of how much flexibility, we can certainly go back to the drawing board and come up with a different amount of flexibility if that's the desire of the board. We can also do that if it's desire of the alderman, if the planning board votes to recommend approval or denial tonight. As far as really at this point, I'm asking the board, what would you like me to do? This all ultimately comes back to the land use plan. This is our guide. It's required to be our guide by virtue of state statute. We have to have one of these if we want to enforce zoning, period. And a lot of smaller local governments are in the process of figuring out how problematic that is. It's a new requirement. Not to us, we've been required to have a land use plan for 50 years because of CAMA. But a lot of these other local governments are really finding out firsthand how important these are, because when you get challenged on your right to enforce zoning, period, that's not very fun. So I can answer any questions you have. I was taking notes as folks were speaking. I'm very appreciative of the public input that we received. I have been very appreciative of it throughout this process. At this point, me as Development Services Director, Mo as City Planner, we're looking for direction from the board as to where you'd like us to go from here.
Anyone have any questions for Travis? Comments?
Travis, for our benefit and for the public here, could you contrast the difference between a PUD and a conditional zoning and the advantages of one over the other? And if a conditional zoning in any way resembles the city laying down and letting a developer do what they want to do. For example, one of the fears is a developer wants to build a 6-story condo.
Sure. So the main difference between PUD and conditional zoning, at least the way that conditional zoning is written now as a text amendment and the way PUD is written today in the ordinance, is the guardrails from a dimensional standpoint. That's, I mean, from the PUD standpoint, there are minimums that you have to meet in order to be eligible to be a PUD. From a lot size perspective, from a setback perspective, there's standards regarding accessory structures and that sort of thing. There is a maximum height that conditional zoning, as the language is written before you tonight, does not include. That's, quite frankly, the main difference in terms of how, what an applicant can actually propose. The difference from a process standpoint is that a conditional rezoning includes that public input meeting requirement, and the way the language is written includes a required planning board public hearing as opposed to giving the planning board discretion. It also is, in terms of adding conditions, in my view, it is easier to add conditions to a conditional rezoning than to a PUD, because you don't have those minimum standards. If you have the minimum standards and someone brings you a proposal that meets those standards, then it's not an administrative by right project, but it's still, if they're meeting the standards of the ordinance, then it gets a little difficult to adequately review the project because they've met what the city wrote in its ordinance to say that it wanted to see. It's not to say you can't add conditions, it just changes the conversation. It also, in my personal opinion, having reviewed subdivisions for quite some time, the notion of a floor, so to speak, of how small you can cluster and a minimum acreage requirement that has to be put in preservation means that there's an intersection point at very near that 20% requirement that's within PUDs today. There is no incentive built into the process for folks to go further than 20%. Ideally, in a conservation subdivision, and I only say this because that was my thesis project, was how local governments incentivize the conservation of land in the subdivision process, is that really, if you're not preserving 40 to 50% of your site as open space, you really aren't gaining the benefit that you think you are. You really start to maximize it when those open spaces are adjacent to otherwise already protected areas, whether that's a creek, whether that's open space in a neighboring subdivision, what have you, a park. So, not saying PUD is not effective at that, but there's limits to its effectiveness. And a conditional rezoning proposal would, with that flexibility in place, would allow for that open space, that incentive to be there. Is that going to be right for every project that comes forward via conditional rezoning? No, it's not. But we've still got that minimum 20% in there. So that way we're making sure it's at least somewhat considered. Did that answer the question?
More or less, but so if the planning board was on the dark side and the Board of Aldermen were on the dark side, and we all thought skyscrapers were great, potentially the public's fear could become a reality, correct?
To the extent the exact same fear exists by the same groups of people amending the UDO to allow that to happen, yes, absolutely. There's no denying that.
So the current UDO height for residential at 40 feet, that would be required to follow that, or no?
Well, the height, if dimensional flexibility is completely at the request of the applicant, then the dimensional, from a height perspective specifically, it defaults to the land use plan. Because the land use plan incorporates a maximum height for every future land use category. So, but that's really all that does is determine what staff's recommendation is. If there's, the way statute is written, if the Board of Aldermen find that an approval is reasonable and in the public interest that doesn't conform to the land use plan, they can make that motion the same way they can on a regular rezoning or via a PUD today. We really can, if it's the pleasure of the board, we can go back and put guardrails on this. It still is the intent of the code. We'd want to know where the board would like to see those guardrails, if that's your desire.
I think for me, the two areas that stick out are the continuous lots bit as well as the dimensional standards. I think going from having dimensional standards and then essentially taking the brakes off and smashing the gas and just completely opening it, I think is too much. I think having some guardrails around that would be wise. What they are specifically, I don't know. And then I think the other part too is the continuous lots is sort of an interesting one, because I think to some folks' point, if you start looking around at the map and start looking at lots, and we said 5 acres, that there are a number of lots that are between 2 to 4 that could be joined up and then now sort of part of this.
Sure.
And so then the question is, well, what's the point of putting 5 if people can sort of subvert that by joining 2 lots together? So I think that would be sort of an interesting thing to work through. I think we table it to discuss those 2 points a little bit further, but that's my thought.
One possible suggestion would be, as far as density, because you said right now there's no guardrails as far as density, is that? Yes. Okay. That we look at that we clarify a percentage. So basically, if dependent upon the size, going in that we clarify a percentage of the amount of units that could go in, but also, and that it may be as little as 5%, 10%, but we come up with a number. We're going to need to come up with a number that is so we're not looking at, like I said, just hitting the gas and going with it.
I guess my question there would be percentage of what?
A percentage of actual, let's say, units, or is if they were asking to put more units into something, we're maybe I'm just getting tired, that's all.
Well,
I'm exhausted, I'm sorry.
I think
I don't want to misspeak anymore. I just want to try and help out here. But also too, those guardrails for the height requirement, definitely so. But it just like we do, like for a PUD has 20%, 20% of open space.
Right.
But that if they do want to do this, that there may be an increase in open space by percentage. They would have to. You see what I'm saying now?
I'm picking up what you're putting down. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. I got you. Yeah. If they want to do it, if they can't increase the open space, then it's they're not adding they're not adding to, or they're not enhancing the PUD itself. They're just trying to fill in.
As your amount of units goes up, the amount of required preserved open space also
Goes up as well. It has to be, that's one thing in consistency that would help. So if they go up 10%, then open space has to go up X number of percent, whatever that would, whatever we could come up with on that.
Yeah, I guess my only hesitation there would be when you're looking at percentage increase in density, when your current zoning districts don't have just a density number, but they have a minimum lot size that determines density.
Yeah.
So there's a couple ways to do that, but outside of fully engineering a site under the by right zoning district, it's not necessarily precise in determining what could be.
But we could do something with the open space.
Sure. Oh,
Okay,
absolutely.
Okay, all right. Okay, that would be a huge concern.
Well, and we could use just a general figure of, divide 43,560 by the minimum lot size, and that could come up with a number. But as we know, that number of a theoretical unit count is not actually realistic. It's because there's roads and wetlands and open space and swimming pools and all kinds of stuff that factor into it too.
Okay.
But
You're feeling me.
I'm picking up what you're putting down, so
Okay,
I can.
all right. Yeah.
I can come up with something there.
Madam Chair, if I may, throughout this whole process tonight, I think what I picked up is the public is saying that this conditional zoning amendment we have here now, if that's implemented, it's going to impact them in a negative way. Now, not counting myself, most people moved here, and a lot moved from cities and other municipalities that were a lot larger. And like me, I moved back home when I became old and broke, and I wanted to be in a place where it was comfortable. I didn't have to deal with the rat race because I've lived in the Los Angeles area, Houston area, Dallas area, so I know what it's like. And this is what I'm getting out. They're saying if we approve this, but also remember, anything the planning board approves, that doesn't mean that it's going to be law. Because I think some of you here before, I think it was Osprey Landing, something we denied it. We went with the public. Everybody was happy. I looked about maybe a couple weeks later, and it went up the ladder, and what we did, they reversed it. So then everybody was mad at the planning board. So that's what I get out of this, that nobody out here in the public wants this to move forward because they feel that it's going to affect their livelihoods and where they're and how they're living now. And on the other side of the coin, new people coming in, because if you look, there's a lot of ads still going on about North Carolina's big secret is Southport. Now, the way I look at it, if you got a you got a bucket that hold 5 gallons of water, and you want to put 10 gallons of water in there, you better pressurize it. So that's what I look at. That's what I think the whole deal is about. They don't want the planning board to approve this because it was going to affect the way they live now in their livelihood. That's just my take on it.